Anyways, I can get started then. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Today we're going to be discussing rollbacks of environmental laws at the federal level, touching a little bit on some issues that we're facing here in Vermont as well. And we'll be hearing from some expert watchdogs in the realm of environmental policy, who I'll introduce in just a minute. But as many of you know, VPIRG has pivoted some of our priorities to be focused as much as we possibly can on the response to the outbreak of COVID-19. And really, that's just because it falls right in line with our mission of protecting and promoting the health of Vermont's people, our environment, and our locally based economy. So this webinar is part of a series that we're doing on the various impacts coronavirus is having on our state and our country and the world. You can find recorded versions of the other webinars that we've done on our website at www.vpirg.org/COVID-19/webinars, and I'll post that link in the chat. And you can find this webinar at that very same website about an hour from now or so. So we're doing these in a live format because we want to encourage people to submit questions throughout it. So if anything occurs to you, please don't hesitate to ask away in the chat, and I'll be monitoring that. And now on to our illustrious guest. I'll give a short intro of both of you, and then I'll give each of you the floor to give some more details on your background if you'd like. But we have with us today Mark Floegel, Research Director for Greenpeace USA, and Drew Hudson, Senior National Organizer for Friends of the Earth. And both Mark and Drew are members of the VPIRG Board of Trustees as well. So thank you for being here, the both of you, and I'll pass it on to you, Mark.
Thanks, Maeve, and thanks, folks, for joining us. In some ways, this is a very, very dry topic, and about regulations and things like this. At the same time, I think this is an important lens to look at the current situation we're in now as a nation, because what we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes really does speak to the values that are being expressed right now by this administration, and I think they're values that are in conflict with the values that we all hold. But I want to kind of start with that frame. As Maeve said, I'm the research director at Greenpeace. I work out of my house in Burlington. Long before I had to work out of my house, I was working out of my house. But I started out in life as a journalist in Western New York. But then I really wanted to get more involved in advocacy, so I came down to Washington, D.C. in the Reagan administration and started working for U.S. Public Interest Research Group, the PIRG that is funded by the state PIRGs that represents your interests down in Washington, D.C. And then later I went to work for Ralph Nader's Congress Watch, and then to Greenpeace for many, many years now. But what I learned, I started out kind of as a policy wonk, but I got drawn into this again by communities. I was a toxics campaigner for about 6 years. This is unfortunately not my first catastrophe. I was down in the Gulf states right after Katrina. I was back in the Gulf states after the BP well explosion in 2010. My work has taken me to some of the most blighted corners of America, and it's really the short end of the stick. And so when we talk about all the rollbacks and all the numbers and all the pollution today, it's mostly falling on the heads of very, very poor people in this country, very often in rural areas like we have in Vermont, very often people of color, and always low income. And that's the kind of stuff that I want to keep in the foreground, is the human toll of what's happening. And with that, I'll pass to Drew.
All right, Drew, let me see if I can unmute you myself. There you go.
There we go. Hey, good morning. Good afternoon, just past morning. So I'm Drew Hudson. My current job is I'm a senior national organizer at Friends of the Earth. So I live in South Carolina these days, but my heart in many ways is in Vermont. In one sense, my spouse literally is in Vermont, quarantined with her elderly parents. My sister and her little baby are in Waterbury. So a lot of my family is still in Vermont. I started at VPIRG in about 2002 and worked with Mark in a back room for a little while, helping to build what became VPIRG's original email program, and was always part of what we called the field team at VPIRG when I worked there. Like Mark, I started out working for other PIRGs in other parts of the country. I grew up in Baltimore, and I started as a door-to-door canvasser in Baltimore as a summer job in between college college semesters, and got a chance to go to DC and help run the national canvas office in Washington, DC for a year. Took time out of school to go do that, and then organized all around the country with a program called Green Corps, which a lot of other VPIRG staff have been through, or other folks have been part of that who've worked for VPIRG before. You know, have, like Mark, done a lot of traveling on this work, and part of what we're bringing you is messages from across the country, you know, the perspectives of communities. A lot of my work right now is with folks who are fighting pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but there's been actually a surge in pipeline building during the pandemic. There was already a stepped up pace under the Trump administration. They've been greenlighting pipelines and trying to kind of ram them through more fast and more frequently. And that has actually accelerated even more during the pandemic. Lots of stuff going on all over the country, but excited to have a couple minutes this afternoon to check in with Vermont family and friends and let you know what's going on in DC and at the national level.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Drew. So glad to have the both of you here, and we can just jump right into it. So when it comes to environmental policy at the federal level, the most obvious and most essential actor that we're often seeing is the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Founded back in 1970, this agency is responsible for researching, monitoring, regulating, and enforcing policies aimed at creating a cleaner and healthier environment for the American people. However, like all government agencies, the EPA is in many ways beholden to the administration that it falls under. So it's really an ever-changing entity. With that said, to start out, Mark, can you give us a little background on some of the key actors working at the EPA right now who are overseeing many of the rollbacks that we'll be discussing? Oh, gosh.
Now I'm off mute.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, the EPA was founded under President Nixon in 1970, and as one of the early administrators said, the role of the EPA was to make sure that the president never had to speak about the environment, because Mr. Nixon was mostly interested in foreign policy. But like Maeve said, in some administrations, the EPA has been a champion of the people. And in other administrations, unfortunately, like this one, like I said, this is an expression of the values of this administration. And right now we are in a period of what we'd call disaster capitalism. About 10 years ago, Naomi Klein wrote a book called Shock Doctrine, in which she talked about how corporations and some governments take advantage of disasters to make money. They see them as economic opportunities. And so we're seeing that from corporations, but also very much inside this administration with the kind of rollbacks that we're seeing of environmental laws. And it's not a surprise because the head of the EPA is a guy named Andrew Wheeler, who started his career as a Senate aide to Senator James Inhofe, who's a senator from Oklahoma, a very famous climate change denier. He went out the revolving door and he worked for many years for a guy named Bob Murray and Murray Energy. And this is a coal magnate who, through some of his own negligence, has managed to kill some of his employees in the mines, takes no responsibility for it, and has been one of the biggest polluters in the country. His aide, or his lobbyist, is now running the EPA. And this has been a pattern that you see across the Trump administration, where you see people from the polluting industries who are lobbyists, from industries like Coke Industries, who are now running the government, who are now supposedly monitoring the folks that they were supposed to monitor. And so as a result, what you get is a wish list from the industries going to the government in these times of crisis and making some very, very strange decisions. Because and if you look who the beneficiaries of the decisions are, they're not individuals, They're the corporations. For example, just this week, the president is saying that he got OPEC, or rather Saudi Arabia and Russia, to reduce the amount of oil that they're pumping, which will raise the price of gas. So in an election year, we have a Republican president who wants higher gas prices at the pump for drivers. And the reason is because it will benefit the American oil industry, which is his real constituency. And so when you see a lot of these rules being rolled back, rules on sulfur dioxide and mercury emissions that are coming from coal plants. And again, we live in New England, so we're going to be the recipients of a lot of this pollution that's coming from this heartland of America, and it's going to attack us through our lungs, which are exactly the same vectors that the COVID-19 attacks. It's where we exchange oxygen into our bloodstream. And that's the same place that we are taking in these pollutants, of which there will now be more, thanks to these decisions that are being made. But I'm going to kick this back to you, Maeve, so I don't ramble on and on.
All right. Well, it's really great to get some of that background, though, because so many of the decisions that are being made are just being made by people who are beholden to others. And it gives us a lot of insight into why these things are happening. So in the last few weeks, we've been pretty consumed, as you might know, by the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and many corporate actors from the fossil fuel, chemical, and plastics industries, just to name a few, have been really working to use this crisis we find ourselves in to reverse many of the regulations and laws that have been put in place in recent years. And in many cases, the Trump administration and the EPA has followed suit by implementing sweeping rollbacks of policies put in place to protect our health and well-being. So Drew, I'll pass it on to you with that, and I'll ask you to speak a little bit about what this trend has looked like and resulted in across the country, specifically like you were talking about the EPA's decision on March 26th to suspend enforcement of environmental policy for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and just to sort of pick up where Mark left off a little bit, what we're seeing from not only the Trump administration, but also their enablers in Congress, especially the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate, is really sort of a 1-2 punch. On the one hand, you have officials like Andrew Wheeler at the EPA, David Bernhardt at the Bureau of Land Management, working to roll back protections. So we saw the EPA put out this sweeping order on March 26th. That they would basically suspend enforcement, that you were free to pollute as much as you wanted while the pandemic was going on, because they were, for health and safety reasons, going to keep their inspectors home, not going out to check on polluting sites. About a week later, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Association agency, PHMSA, put out almost an identical statement saying that they would no longer do inspections of pipelines during the pandemic, again, ostensibly to protect their workers, but really giving a green light to people who are building pipelines to not put up adequate erosion control, to not do safety checks on incredibly dangerous and explosive gas and oil pipelines. And we've seen corporations really take advantage of that opportunity, that door that's opened by bad oversight and bad regulation. Just a couple of examples from the last few weeks since the pandemic really started. Up in Canada, the Coastal GasLink pipeline is a huge gas pipeline that's proposed to go west to the west coast of Canada. Through mostly indigenous territories, the Wet'suwet'en. People have been fighting the pipeline and saying that it does not have permission to cross their tribal lands. And the pipeline actually increased construction pace and sent in the RCMP, the Mounties, but armed police to enforce their right to invade sovereign tribal land and to keep building the pipeline, literally at the end of a gun. Here in the States, a lot of folks have seen the news last week that Keystone XL is moving ahead with what they call pre-construction activities. This is basically building the man camps, the housing for people who would build the pipeline. Even though the pipeline does not have permits in the US yet to be built, it doesn't actually have permission to go ahead, but they're acting as if it does, and in fact using the pandemic and a declaration that was made that oil and gas pipelines are essential infrastructure and therefore exempt from state stay-at-home orders and other local orders to stay away and do social distancing. So that construction has been going on, putting, again, the health of indigenous people, ranching communities and rural communities in Nebraska and other states at risk. And in the southeast, to where I am, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline and Mountain Valley Pipeline have actually been bringing in busloads of workers from Louisiana. Most of the people who build oil and gas pipelines aren't local in the communities. They're brought in from Texas and Louisiana and other people who are, comfortable or experienced building pipelines and fossil fuel infrastructure. And they've been bringing in busloads of those workers from Louisiana to West Virginia to very isolated rural communities that already don't have enough health infrastructure to deal with a serious outbreak of the pandemic. And then those workers are working in unsafe conditions, close together, groups of 10 or more at a time, doing construction activities. Again, on a pipeline that right now there's a court case pending at the Supreme Court. They haven't issued a decision yet on whether or not the Mountain Valley Pipeline can proceed, but the company's going ahead with it. So one of the things to know is that there's really this sort of full court press on from different agencies that are under the Trump administration's control. And so far, Congress has not been doing a lot to step up and defend them. I know we're going to be talking, VPIRG is going to talk to some staff from Bernie Sanders' office later this week. And that's been one of the real highlights. Bernie and a couple of our other really staunch allies in the United States Senate have been trying to hold the administration accountable and demand answers from them. But so far, they have not actually been effective at stopping Trump's administration from moving ahead on a lot of these things. And there's another round of coronavirus response legislation getting debated in the United States Congress right now, sometimes called the CARES Act. You may have heard about it in the papers, but we're looking for some strict controls to be put into that legislation that will curtail the ability of pipeline companies and fossil fuel companies to proceed with normal activities during the pandemic, because so far we have not gotten that in previous congressional responses.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks, Drew. I also will mention that, so often we conflate these issues with just the fossil fuel industry, but in doing some of the research on this, I also saw a lot of things on the other side that, with comment periods for certain pesticide uses, like Elite 27 is one that I saw an example of. It's kind of the worst Roundup from what I understand. The comment periods aren't being publicized as they usually are. So I don't know if either of you have any comments on that, but it's just another aspect of this issue.
I'll just say that there are many things in this administration that are not as they usually are, from the fulfillment of Freedom of Information Act requests. In fact, we actually got one last week. It was very strange. It was in a, we did get the information we asked for. It was in a format we cannot find a machine that accepts because it's from like the 80s, even though the information is fairly current. But yeah, strange things happen in this administration.
Yeah, and just not giving, the public health and environmental community the same opportunities to have their voice heard in a lot of these conversations. So we gotta be louder, I guess. So moving on, I'll keep it with you, Mark, in that same vein. On the 31st of March, President Trump formally rolled back the CAFE standards, or corporate average fuel economy standards, reducing drastically gas mileage and emissions requirements put in place under President Obama. So it's definitely going to result in untold negative consequences for the American economy and our health, as well as the global climate crisis. So can you elaborate a little bit on some of the long-term effects of that?
Yes, I mean, well, this will add to the death toll, period. If there were no COVID, this would add to the death toll. There is a long time statistically proven correlation between fuel efficiency standards and human health. And with the new standards that the Trump administration is now putting in place, we can expect about 8,700 extra deaths between now and 2050. So in the next 30 years, an extra about 9,000 people would die. That's exclusive of COVID. But as we've said before, COVID attacks our deep lungs. Not all who get it, thank goodness, die from it. We don't know what it will be like if you have a bad case of COVID and survive, if you will wind up with more scar tissue. But again, this is more CO2 going into the atmosphere to warm the planet. This is more asthma in urban areas, again, low income areas, more health effects in those areas. 8,700 people dead, many, many more hospitalized. And what is worse about it, even if you don't care about the environment, even if you don't care about global warming, it will make the U.S. automotive industry uncompetitive, because this will be the only country in the world where you can sell these cars, because they will not meet anyone else's standards. As a matter of fact, they won't meet standards in this country. And I think this, to my mind, is one of the hearts of this reason, is that California and some automakers have agreed that they will adhere to the stronger Obama era level emission standards. And the Trump administration and some other automakers are kind of essentially going to war with California and the states that are aligning with California. So yes, if this is something that's personally getting under the president's skin, I would say it is. But again, at the base, it is still a gift to his primary constituencies, which are going to be the extractive industries like the oil industries. And so again, this is government prioritizing private wealth over public health. And this literally is what disaster capitalism is about: who gets saved and who gets paid. And as we're seeing frontline people dropping selflessly, everyone from subway drivers to doctors to nurses who are trying to keep this country going, we're seeing a very, very few people get very rich on this, and they're the wrong folks. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just ask, how easy is it to put back in place, our former CAFE standards? Is that an easy process?
Well, we were on target to meet these things, and again, many of the automakers are already meeting them in models of cars that are sold all around the world. These standards can be met. What it means is and again, this is corporate average fuel efficiency. So you can still buy and build large vehicles that are needed for specific purposes like construction and industry and things like that. Doesn't mean you can't. Ford and Toyota can't make those things, but that means that they have to have an average. So folks who want a fuel efficient car can get a fuel efficient car. And again, with our president doing everything he can to drive up the price of gas and push less fuel efficient cars onto the market, it's clear that he's not working for the good of the folks instead of, like I say, his primary constituency.
Yes, it does seem quite transparent when you get down to it. But before
I was just gonna, can I stick in one other thing before we leave CAFE standards too? One thing this does highlight, right after Trump was elected, the summer canvass campaign was Vermont Fights Back. Mm-hmm. And this is like a redux of that, right? Everything happens much faster and more intensely right now, but it is the same fight. And Vermont is a part of a couple of multi-state coalitions that are really important right now. One of them is the CAFE standards. We've opted into the California car rules, the higher rules. So our attorney general in Vermont can help with that lawsuit, can fight the Trump administration and try and keep those tougher mileage standards in place. Another great one is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the carbon trading plan amongst Northeast states, which the Trump administration has also been attacking since day one, since he was inaugurated. He's been trying to boost the coal industry and fight the efforts of Vermont and other states to have less polluting power in the mix as part of that kind of average economy. And Vermont has a opportunity to fight mostly through our attorney general. A lot of it is legal right now. But there's great opportunities for us to maintain our leadership position. And somebody was asking, how do you take advantage of the crisis, the Nation magazine cover? This is one of the things we can do right now is getting our attorney general to be out front, along with the attorney generals from California and New York and Massachusetts and other states that have a like-minded pollution control mechanisms to Vermont. And getting those lawsuits in right now while the crisis is happening is actually key to the legal strategy. If we wait until after the pandemic and then we say, well, we wish it hadn't rolled back, then we won't have as good standing in court. We need people to actually be acting right now and pushing on these lawsuits right now. And there's a lot going on, so I'm sure the Attorney General has plenty to do, but making sure that he stays on top of that is one of the great things VPIRG has been doing, kind of watchdogging the watchdogs.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I would consider that a nugget of positivity. So thank you, Drew, for bringing that up, because that is something that we could be doing right now and encouraging our AG as well as legislators and to raise our voices and to get involved and call out our federal government. But Mark, would you like to add anything? I know Drew touched on it, but Richard had a question in the chat asking you both to share some opinions on the nation's cover story, How Not to Waste This Crisis?
Yeah, I think this presents us with a lot of opportunities. First off, I think and again, yes, crisis and opportunity go hand. Just as Japan learned after the tidal wave and the Fukushima disaster, or the tsunami and the Fukushima disaster, that they didn't need to rely on nuclear power as much, or they could redo their grid to be much more efficient, and invest in things that save electricity and work in better ways. So can we. I mean, I think a lot of what I've seen here in Vermont has been a relocalization of our economy as we're trying to support each other through this, either through necessity or for goodwill. I know everyone I know is eating all the Ben & Jerry's they can to support the dairy farmers up in Franklin County. But this is also a time when political ideas get great traction, because people are seeing the effects of bad decisions by government in their lives. And it is an election year. And I have to say, this election that is coming up in just over 6 months is, I think, the most momentous thing that has happened in this 244-year experiment in government that we've engaged in. And so I think it's going to be it is more important than ever that we vote in our local elections. Obviously, town meetings passed for this year, but every seat that's on the ballot coming up in November is going to be an important one. So it's going to be very important for us all to get out, vote, talk to politicians, hold them accountable. That's why VPIRG is a great vehicle for doing that, for letting up politicians know what needs to be done. And that includes, we need to talk to Senators Leahy, Sanders, Congressman Welch. I think someone from Senator Sanders' office is going to be on this webinar on Thursday. Yes, they are all great folks, and they're pushing a good agenda down in Washington. They need to hear from us, though, because there's so many things for them to do. They need to know how to prioritize those things. And again, one quick point that I do want to throw in for all the nerds before we stop. We will probably see a diminution in some of this rollback action coming next month. There's a thing called the Congressional Review Act, which says that Congress can undo actions by the federal government that occur in the previous 60 congressional days, which means that Congress, as of May, Congress is only scheduled to meet for about 60 days till the end of the year, because it's an election year. They let the members go home and run for re-election. And so after May, we hope that the next Congress will undo a lot of the actions that the Trump administration is taking. But that means that these are the weeks when we really have to be paying attention, talking to our legislators. Anything that we can stop from going through now or raise our voices about now is going to be very, very important. So doing things just like you're doing, showing up for meetings like this, educating yourselves, and getting involved. You are the soul of America. Thanks. Thank you very much for everything.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. That's a great lead-in. You all might have seen that VPIRG, we're doing a lot of work on trying to ensure that absentee ballots are available to all registered voters in Vermont, and ideally around the country, to make it as accessible as possible come November. So that's one thing to watch. But I also just wanted to mention before, in our last couple minutes here, that Vermont isn't totally immune to a lot of these corporate pushbacks. So a few weeks, these past few weeks, our environmental health team here at VPIRG has been, working to fight back against an effort by Casella and other waste haulers to freeze recycling requirements in the state, sending all of that material to the Casella-owned landfill in Coventry. So we no doubt obviously understand that workers at recycling facilities really deserve every single protection possible from the transmission of COVID-19, but that really shouldn't mean that we completely disregard our environmental policies to do so. So if this is something that you're concerned about, be sure to go to our website and sign on to our petition urging the legislature to protect our recycling program here in Vermont. And I also want to give a shout out in that same kind of realm to Mark and his team at Greenpeace for recently putting together some really great research exposing the plastic bag industry's attempts to exploit the crisis that we find ourselves in and attack bag bans like ours here in Vermont. So would either of you like to add anything before we get going?
Thank you for that. Yes, we've been doing quite a bit of work on plastics at Greenpeace. And yes, and it does also speak to the misinformation that you are going to see around COVID, around environmental issues around COVID. This will be used as an excuse to sneak all kinds of things past us as the public. That's why it is important for folks like you to be involved. And it's why organizations like VPIRG are so important, because we do need trusted sources of information. We're blessed in Vermont to have a pretty decent journalism environment up here, so we have some pretty decent press here. But yes, watchdogs are necessary now more than ever to keep folks in government and industry honest.
Drew, anything to add?
No, thanks for doing this, and thanks everybody for tuning in. The one other sort of piece of good news I think a lot of us have seen is, if you haven't already, go find the pictures online of big cities like New York and Los Angeles right now during the shutdown. I think one thing this is doing is it's resetting people's knowledge and expectations. We've never seen levels of pollution this low from automobiles because so many people aren't commuting. And that's not a plug for like the pandemic is a good thing or anything like that. But it is just people seeing that actually we can survive without polluting automobiles, without relying on coal power, without some of these things, is going to reset expectations, we hope. And I think when we come out of this crisis, whenever that is, in a couple months or a couple weeks or however long it takes, then we will be in a new world, especially federally, but also in Vermont, for what people are willing to accept in terms of healthcare, in terms of access to mail-in ballots, in terms of oversight of polluters, and how clean the air should be, how clean the water should be. And that's all good stuff that we should make sure people don't lose faith or lose their expectations, go back to the way things were, because we don't want things to go back to just the way they were. We want things to be better in the future after this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, everybody. Drew and Mark, thanks for being a part of this. And then thanks for everybody else for tuning in. Be sure to share this video if you found it useful with your friends. It'll be on our website and Facebook. But thanks so much, everybody. Signing out.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
All right.